are going to be a description of kind of the organism we talked about, and being able to pick which organism it is. So I'll give you a description, and then you have to tell me like what bacteria it is, or what virus it is. So that's the first 1, 2, 3. First 3 questions. There's questions on here about the immune response. So questions about like the different types of antibodies, questions about B cells and T cells, just the stuff we talked about. Difference between natural acquired active immunity and acquired passive immunity, artificial acquired passive, artificial acquired active, like knowing the difference between those. Knowing how to interpret infectious doses. Remember we talked about like ID50s and LD50s. So if you have a population of like 10 mice and you want to see what the dose is that makes 50% of them sick, whatever dose made 5 of those 10 mice sick is their ID50. The lower the ID50 is that good or bad? Bad, right? Because it doesn't take as much to get you sick. Same thing for lethal dose 50. Lethal dose 50 is how the dose is that kills 50% of the population. So if you have 10 mice, you inject them all at the same dose, 5 of them die, that's your LD50. Just like with ID50, the lower that number is, that's not good. The lower, the worse it is, because it means it takes less to kill you. We talked a little bit about, I think I might ask that on here somewhere, if the ID50 and LD50 doses are real close to one another, remember that's really bad too, because that means the dose to make you sick versus kill you is pretty much the same, so not good. Now there's between antigenic drift and antigenic shift. We talked about that. We talked about that in regards to the flu. Some more questions on here about like it gives you characteristic and you have to pick which bacterium it is. The different things we talked about, the different characteristics of the bacteria and the viruses for different infections and stuff. Like if I said it made like a coagulase or something, kind of be familiar with the ones I talked about. The difference between like an intoxication versus a toxico infection. We talked about that a little bit tonight. So intoxication, remember you're getting something just from being exposed to the toxin. A toxico infection is the bacteria is in there growing and it's making toxin. So it's actively multiplying. Note the different routes we talked about, like fecal to oral and parental transmission and what vectors and vehicles and all those things are. So some definitions on here. Some things is like, these are the symptoms, like what organism is it? Actually, it's like that detailed. Yeah, more questions on here about like these are kind of the characteristics of the organism, not which organism, and I'm not going to. Questions on here about the antibodies and the different antibodies. So IgG, IgM, IgA, IgD, IgD. Like know those the characteristics that are on the PowerPoints or in the PowerPoints. About the prions, we talked about those a little bit towards the end of the viral disease lecture. Another question here about the ID50s. You don't need to know the ID50s for like a random organism. Like when you're like, what's the ID50 for cells? You don't need to know that. But understand what an ID50 is. Again, know about the immune cells. We talked about like B cells and T cells. Just the things we talked about there. That was kind of a broad overview. There's a few questions on here about the differences between the different kinds of immunity, the natural active and natural passive, and artificial active and artificial passive. There's a few questions about that. So if you know the definitions, you should be fine. More characteristics, and more questions about the different types of antibodies. Kind of have an idea, we talked about immunology, about the difference between kind of the primary response to an infection versus what happens when they're re-exposed to it. That's sometimes referred to as a recall response. I think we refer to it in here as a secondary response. It's the same thing. They're symptoms. that first exposure, there has to be interaction between like helper T cells and B cells to start making antibodies, so it takes a while for that to happen. During that secondary response, it happens a lot faster because that interaction doesn't have to occur. The B cells can start making antibodies on their own, with the B cells. So understand that. As we talked about it. Questions about that? Know the route by which these different pathogens are transmitted, like Vibrio cholerae, like transmitted fecally. So you have to give some kind of feed material and something that's being consumed. So it's specified in the slide. It's not specified, don't worry about it, but anything that's up there you should kind of be familiar with. Another ID 50 question. More stuff about what this is actually giving some questions about the stuff we talked about tonight and the time before. It's just like giving you some characteristics and you have to identify which microorganism is causing the disease or like what microorganism we're talking about. Understanding those membrane attack complexes we talked about is all of a result of complement cascade. So remember those membrane attack complexes are going to poke holes in anything that has a membrane, so bacterial cells and viruses and inactivate them. Another question about different kinds of antibodies. Some more questions on here about different characteristics, you can tell which organism it is, or a lot of those questions. Another mechanism like portal of entry kind of thing. Not in the 60s. Some more questions like that. It's like here's the characteristics of this, like which organism we're talking about. Another ID 50 question. So understand ID 50 because I think we have counted 5 questions on that one. Some more. There's a lot of questions on here that are. I give like characteristics and you guys pick which organism I'm talking about. There are a ton of those questions. Know what a nosocomial infection is? Remember that's a hospital-acquired infection. More characteristic ones. More characteristic ones. More characteristic ones. So yeah, be able to match things up with what's what. We talk about the different kinds of epidemics. We'll know the different definitions, so like know what an endemic versus an epidemic versus a pandemic is, and then know the different kinds of epidemics we talked about, like the common source and the propagated, so that's all stuff that's on the slides to be able to tell the difference between those. And I think I mentioned this already, but know the definitions, what's a fomite, what's a vehicle, what's a vector, and know those kind of things. More characteristics. And that is it. Another question about antigenic shift and drift. So know those two, what those definitions are. And that's 75 questions. And that exam's not until